Hello Empire, Garrett here with part 2 in this edition of Regent's Corner. So part 2 of the leather dice project. We've already done all our stamping, we've done all that. I already cased the cased it off camera because, 20-30 minutes of watching leather dry is not fun. I certainly don't do it. So now, if you notice, I went ahead and I put blue tape on the back. I just put about 2 layers of blue painter's tape, and that keeps the leather from expanding and stretching while we do all our carving and stuff. So first, I'm going to take my swivel blade with a 1/4 inch filigree ceramic blade. I'll go ahead and we're going to drop it. I've discussed how to do this plenty of times, but I always like to start with a fresh, sharp blade. It's very, very important when you do when you're gonna start your carving. So we're gonna start. I'm just gonna carve this design here, and then we'll get into the stamp work. So I like to start at the corners and the points. This way, when I do it, I'm not overcutting. I like to start there. And all we do is just a nice smooth, pick it up right at the last second. Then we're going to start right here. And of course, it's very important to keep your blade straight and even. Let me rotate that a little bit. This is where good lighting is very important. We want to make sure we have good light, because if you can't see this, it's going to make it very difficult. And like I said, it's okay to rotate your project. A little bit more there. There we go. So I like to pull towards me, go towards myself versus pulling away. Lets me see where I'm doing a lot easier. And of course, we'll go nice and slow. Take your time. We don't want, there's no need to rush. And we're just going to follow our line work. Now, if you're not comfortable going all the way to the end and pulling up last minute, you can always stop just a little bit short and coming in the end there and drop it in. So we're just going to do it like that. Cut that line right there. And we'll start right there. And bring it in. So that's a nice way to do it if you're not comfortable necessarily with starting and ending. Okay. Trying to make sure I don't block your view of this, so you guys can see how I'm doing. And then, like I said, we're just going to do these corners here, so we don't want to we want to watch our overcuts. Now, this is the nice thing about with the craft aids is you get a nice good indent. It makes it much easier to follow the pattern. And as you see, I'm just rotating my knife as I need to go around the curves. So we follow it, and then I'm just working just that edge there. I'm not putting the whole blade down. I'm just working that corner. And what I like to do is I like to line up the edge with here, so when I'm putting my line work down there, I'm following this edge here, so I'm making sure I stay in line with the pattern. Just my little way of keeping track of where it goes. And then a nice, as far as how it's cased, see here it's kind of dry. You can't, obviously can't feel it, but it's a little cool to the touch. So that tells me it's nice and cased well. And we're just going to keep, boom. And it's okay to rotate and turn your project. Lots of times it's better to, we don't want to be blindsiding it. That's how you tend to miss stuff. And then once I'm done with this should be nice and dry enough that we're going to go ahead and do some beveling and some stamping. And that'll pretty much be part 2. I'm going to save part 3. We're going to go ahead and make this a 3-parter. Because frankly, don't have time for it to dry and then do the dye and finishing and all that. So it might even turn into a 4-part because we have to let the dye and everything dry. And I'm going to show you my way of how I get a pretty common technique, I guess, but the way I like to do things to really get the color and design of my, that I personally really like to do. It's just my style. But something like this, the great thing is you can do it almost any color. Oh my gosh, the Angelus leather dye is fantastic for small projects like this. You can get some really bright and gorgeous dye colors on it if you if that's what you want. But I like to go with the more aged antique, you know, weathered look of stuff. That's just personal preference. That's just my style. But yeah, you could easily do this in a very bright, like say blue or orange or purples and all kind, you know. It's, as I always say, it's your project. Do what you want. Now this line I'm pushing away. Sometimes I like to just practice doing that. Pushing away from myself. It gives me a good chance to really look at that angle. Sometimes it's easier. That's why you want to practice doing both ways. Sometimes, you know, depending on the design work, it can be easier to push away than to push towards yourself like that. So sometimes it's just easier to change things up. It's good practice. And well, maybe I'm pretty sure I did the video about practicing your carving skills. Let's see, we get just a little bit more right there. There we go. Okay. So it looks like we got everything. Now I'm just going back over and touching up a few spots, making sure my cuts go all the way in. This will be important later when we go to do the beveling. All right. So let's just make sure. Yep. Okay, we're just a little short there. We're just filling in, making sure all the lines match up. There we go. I think that's pretty decent. Some of this will hide with the bevel and some of it will hide with stamping. Okay, so that's really about it for that. So that's the carving. Now for the stamping, let's see. I think we're going to use that there. So I'm going to be using my 1 pound maul. I got my super fancy one here. You can also buy a really cheap basic one for $16 online for a 1 pound. I like the 1 pound weight. Some people prefer a lighter weight, 8 ounce, but I find 8 ounce is just too light for my taste. I want a little bit more heft when I'm striking with. So let's see, what do we want to do first? Okay, so now at this point you have the options. You can either bevel the whole thing, call it done, or you're like me, I like to background stamp all this stuff here. So I'm going to use, what number is this? A 199W textured stamp right there. That's what I like to use for my background stamp. Once again, just gives it a nice texture. Now we want the leather to be nice and even more dry than when we carve, because we don't want the leather to smush. We want it to just compress, and it'll leave a more crisp pattern. Now when I'm doing this, I work it right up to the edge there, and we work the edge, especially with a small pear shape shader like this. And as you see right there, we get a nice little design in there. And we're just going to keep doing that to all the pieces. This is why I prefer a nice 1 pound over, say, an 8 ounce. Now, of course, that's a personal preference thing. Especially if I were sitting here, say, for 8-9 hours a day, people tend to use lighter hammers, because, obviously you can imagine just holding a 1 pound hammer up at an angle like this for hours would really hurt. That's why they also make 45-degree hammers, so you can sit here and hold it at a more comfortable 45 and still strike the thing. But once again, that's personal preference. I think there's no difference in price, at least as far as the Berry King goes. And I can't not say enough good things about their stuff. They're definitely more expensive than anything you'll find at Tandy. But when it comes to leather tools, you kind of tend to pay what you get for. You get what you pay for. So you want a high quality, sharp impression, all that, you're going to pay some money. That's just the nature of the beast. Now I like to put the pointer end right into the corners rather than the round end. That way it makes it a lot easier to get right up into that corner there, because we want to go right up to that edge without going over it. And I like to pick it up and move it around a lot, especially when you're working in these small detailed areas. And this takes more time than just straight beveling everything, but it's just my style. I like the way it looks, especially when I antique it and paint it. You can get a really nice contrast to it. Once again, this is all personal style and preference. We're just gonna we want to work right up to the edge. We obviously don't want to go over the edge, because I don't want to. We're trying to give it some depth this way, depth with using texture. Now I'm using a rough style stamp. You could also use a checker stamp. You can use there's all kinds of backgrounders. Now what I like to do when I have enough room with this, I like to get my bigger one in there and just kind of evens out that texture there. When you're using a smaller one like this, doesn't require a lot of pressure. As you can tell, I'm not hitting it very hard. I'm just giving it light taps. There's no need, you don't have to slam it hard. We're not, this is more finesse here. Not brute strength. We're not just punching things through. We only want to so we're just going to keep doing this. I might move on to beveling real quick just so we can get that in this video. Because I'm trying not to have this one go for 40 minutes again. I know last video was really long, but I'm trying to give you guys an idea of just how long sometimes these projects can take. And this is really the time eater here. If there's any time you really need to take your time, it is when you start getting into the stamping, carving, backgrounding, all that good stuff. The biggest thing with leatherwork, frankly, is you're not going to get stuff typically done very quickly. Little projects like keychains, yeah, sure, you can get that done especially if you're not doing anything fancy with it and you're just cut, dye, and call it done. Then yeah, you can get it done pretty quick. But stuff like this, it usually takes me a day or two. Even to do a very simple, straightforward project like this, simply because you gotta let things dry. Especially when I go to dye it. After I dye it, I have to give it typically 8 hours or longer to dry in between the coat, the main dye, and then the antique that we're going to do. So that's something, this is why it can take weeks sometimes, depending on the project. You don't want to rush. Definitely something you have to learn is patience when it comes to leather work. You can't, if you rush it, it's gonna look rushed, and everybody's gonna know it was rushed. So I typically will work on a project for an hour or two at a night, get a certain amount done, then stop for the night, get to a stopping point. Now let's say I'm working on a big piece and I'm carving this entire thing, and I don't have the time, I'm not there, work calls up, whatever, right? So what I would do is I would go ahead and re-soak this in leather, recase it, get myself a big enough Ziploc bag, or if it's a really big project, I'll wrap it in saran wrap. Wrap it up real good, put it in there, and then I'll go toss it in my fridge. And then it can stay like that for quite a couple days, actually, before we would need to do anything. Before I have to come back to it. Now this was only surface case, so that's why it only took about 20 minutes to allow it to case to this point. So now we've done all the background stamping. Next comes the fun part. Let me touch that one up. There we go. And that's going to be the beveling. And so we're going to go ahead and, now for this one, I recently started using a textured beveler, which gives it a really neat, cool look on this, especially with this. This one happens to be an 8802 craft tool. This one's okay. It's a little rounded, it's not as deep. You also have plain bevelers. They're smooth. Then one advantage I will say, the nice thing about a textured one is, especially when you first starting out, is it doesn't really leave tool marks because the texture hides it. So what we're going to do with this is we're going to just drop it right into that edge there. Hope that shows up on camera. So we're going to drop it into that edge, and a nice straight up and down. I don't think my leather's quite dry enough yet. I might have to let it dry for a little while longer, honestly. This is not... It's getting a little mushy for my taste. It's pushing into the leather. But I guess we'll go ahead and press forward. This is another thing I don't like about this specific one. It's kind of round on the end, so it doesn't give you as quite a good sharp. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bevel all these edges where it should underlap, and that's going to give it that look of it under, you know, interwoven and going over and under like it should. And I just pick it up, move it a little bit, pick it up and move it. Especially with a textured one, you're not going to slide it like you normally would with a smooth beveler. That's... And we're just going to go ahead and... As you see there, we're just going to work the outside. I'm going to go in there and work it all kind of together. And this is going to give it depth, detail, and it's going to help it stand out and pop more than if I just left it alone. This is also another really time-consuming part. This is another one of those parts that a lot of people will just absolutely find it brutal. They hate it. It's repetitive. It's blah. A lot of people find this part to be the least favorite. I can't say it's my favorite, but I don't mind it so much. It's, you know, to me, it's just helps me blank out, focus on what I'm doing, and I just go with it. So I don't find it. Now, granted, I'm not doing some huge piece where I'm doing a 40, 60-inch long belt where I'm having to bevel the entire thing do this entire thing by hand, where it takes 60 hours of work. Now, just in case you're curious, underneath here is a marble granite top. This just happens to be a sink top from a remodel that I scored. But Tandy in most places will sell you a little 12-inch square one. But like I said, if you're creative, you can go down to all kinds of places. Maybe find a scrap yard, find somewhere there, local stone place, and you can probably score a big piece of unused scrap. So that will fit your size. And I'm just kind of all over the place with it. I just like to go as I go. But you just want to make sure you do that. When you bevel it, you want to make sure you bevel it to make it look like it's going under or over, depending on... I don't want to do it opposite way, like this, because that wouldn't look right. If I did it wrong and I did it on this side, it just wouldn't look right, because it, there. We want to go this way, so it makes it look like it's going under the main piece there. Now, because this one has a bit of more rounded edge, I'm having to put a little more forward tilt to it. Yeah, a quality beveler, you shouldn't have to do that. This is definitely a cheap Tandy. I hate to say that, but I normally like their stuff. But I might have to invest the money for some Berry Kings here soon. But to give you an idea, these are $8 at my Tandy store, whereas a Berry King is $30. So gives you an idea of the price difference. But at the same time, as I say lots of times, you get what you pay for. And their quality is definitely speaks for itself as far as Berry King goes. And I just pick it up and move it. And we're going to keep. Now when I'm hitting it, I'm not hitting it so hard that I completely dig into the leather. I just want to hit it hard enough to leave an imprint and the pattern. Sometimes that means going back over it a little bit. But what we want is a nice, clean, sharp pattern. And we're getting there. And like I said, I don't mind this part. I just keep going over, looking at it, make sure I missed right here. I always make sure I don't miss anything. See if I have to go back over something. Now the nice thing about this is you probably don't have to worry about re-wetting it when you're beveling because you want it fairly dry. So now when you're carving, you want to keep it to a certain point where you should not feel drag, it should not feel texture. It should be a nice, smooth, continuous cut. If it starts feeling like it's dragging or catching, then I would suggest dropping your blade real quick. And then if it's still doing it, then I would add a little bit of water, moisture to it, hence with a sponge. Just enough to get the surface wet. Now, depending on the beveler, especially custom ones like Berry King, you can get ones that have a steeper angle that give you even a sharper downward look to it. It's all a matter of once again, part of it's personal preference, part of it's what the look you're going for. And this is the part realistically where you can really hide a good amount of mistakes, little minor things. Like right there, I kind of missed the end there, but by the time I bevel it down, you'll never know it was there. And there's always going to be some imperfections. I mean, that's how handmade leather works. I can always tell if I look at a leather piece if it was done carved by hand or not. If everything's perfect and uniform and there's no mistakes anywhere, it was done by a machine. It was run through a press. It was run through a roller. I can guarantee it. There's a look, the natural imperfections of the leather and the natural imperfections of doing things by hand. Even a absolute master of their craft, somebody's been doing it for 50 years and the most famous leather worker ever, will promise you they make mistakes. There's little imperfections in the project in leather. There is no such thing as perfect unless you're doing it with a machine. So don't get discouraged if it doesn't look 100% perfect machine made. That's kind of the point of handmade items, is that imperfections and the little details and the stuff that you can only get with a handmade item. Okay, I think I'm just going to wrap this up here. Then I look at it. If I see like this looks a little too shallow somewhere, or I don't like it's deep enough, I'll go back over it, even it out. Maybe go back over it a little bit more where I want a little more depth. So I try to get my outside beveling down fairly deep because I really want this to pop, especially once I antique it, and once it gets antiqued, paint it, which will come in the dye, paint, and antique part will come in part 3, simply because at this point now I would normally let the leather dry because it is wet. I soaked the whole thing, so we don't want to. And then I like to look at it, pick it up, angle it, make sure I didn't miss any spots. Something small and easy like this one's not too hard, but if I get into a bigger, more complex pattern, you want to make sure you don't miss anything. I'm thinking, okay, let me touch up that spot just a little bit. Oh no, I think this is pretty good right here. So this is usually the point where I would stop. We're going to let it dry overnight, or about 8 hours. I'll probably film part 3 tonight after park. And then, so in part 3, I'll show you how I oil and dye and potentially antique a piece. And then we'll finally finish off with, and then paint and final assembly. So this might actually end up, this will probably end up fortunately be like a 4-part video. So I think what we'll do is I will post parts 1 and 2 for now for this week. And then I will film 3 and 4 for next week's video. And it's okay to go back over it. Like I said, I like to go back over and make sure everything's even, get the right amount of detail in there. So I get a nice good depth of what I want, make sure everything's even. Like I said, the leather was a little bit softer than I probably would prefer normally. I would give it another 10-15 minutes to dry before I really started stamping. But it's just now getting to the point where I like it. I like it definitely on the dry side. Not completely dry, mind you. You do want, you got to compress the leather down, the fibers. But it is getting, I can feel the difference. I'm getting a much better, deeper impression along the edge there. It's definitely sinking in better. I'm getting a much nicer. And I'm not using any more pressure. I'm just getting a much, I can feel the leather compressing better. Yeah, see how much nicer that's starting to really pop and really come out dark. And that's going to even pop even more when I go to antique this. So with this, I think let me just give it a little bit more right here. All right, that is looking fantastic. I'm really happy with the way that's looking. So with that, we will call this part 2. As you can see, that's how I carve, stamp, and bevel a small project like this, something that we've covered before, but now you get to see it in action in full length. And part 3, if you're still interested, we will dye and antique, and I will show you how to do that. And then part 4 we'll probably go ahead and paint and clear coat and do the final assembly. So with that, we are done with today's video. And so until next time, stay crafty.